Fall at Equestria, M.I.A. by CivilWarPony. Read by Forrest M. Chapter 3. Unthawing the Past. Airborne looks around at the dank interior of the stable, walking through stagnant puddles and piles of garbage that litter the hallways. As they walked deeper into the stable, the more they encountered the bones of long-dead ponies. Among the bones, rusted pitbucks and shreds of clothing lay in heaps on the floor. On the walls, faded bloodstains stood as markers to some long-forgotten violence that destroyed the lives of the ponies in Stable 200. Mournfully looking at the remains of the ponies, Airborne says,
"This isn't right. They came down here to avoid dying up on the surface, and instead they found death inside of this gilded tomb."
Sunrise carefully steps over the bones and says,
"They shouldn't be dead. The stables were built to protect the population of Equestria, not be a place where they would come to die. What happened here?"
Airborne shrugs and says,
"I don't know. Whatever happened here, it was bad."
Airborne's hooves kick spent bullet casings down the hall, breaking the silence of the place as the ancient casings bounce along the hall. Bailout finds the armory on the upper levels near the Overmare's office. The door itself was slightly ajar, the hinges rusted beyond repair. Looking at the door, Bailout tries to force it open, but the door doesn't move. Eventually, he bucks the door with his hind hooves, and the door crashes to the floor. Walking inside of the armory, Bailout sees the shelves are lined with box after box of ammo. The weapons lockers still stand with various firearms still inside. Only 2 of the weapon lockers stand empty. Searching through the lockers, Bailout says,
"Well, I guess it's my lucky day. Look what we have here."
Leaning over, Bailout pulls out a shotgun with a large 40-round drum and foregrip. The weapon is covered in sky blue and gray camo paint to disguise the weapon. On the stock, an etching reads, "Cloud Hammer." Bailout gets ready to leave the armory to join up with Airborne until something catches his eye. He smiles and says,
"Airborne would love to see this."
Starshine makes her way towards the Overmare's office. She tries to open the door to the Overmare's office, but it doesn't budge. A number of overturned metal desks form crude barriers in front of the door to the computer core. Pushing the door open with her hoof, she enters the dark room and manages to flip on the light, which sends sparks pouring down onto her, singeing her mane. In front of her lies a single skeleton with a small terminal pad lying amongst the remains of the pony's ribcage. Bending down to pick up the terminal pad, the screen flickers, then goes dark. Sighing, Starshine says,
"This is something that Sunrise could easily fix. I have no idea how ponies back during the war used these things."
Starshine sees a small revolver lying next to the skeleton. Picking it up, she spins the chamber to see if it will still rotate. On the hoof grip, she sees the words, "Duty before honor," written onto the metal frame. Taking the revolver and placing it into her utility barding, she trots out of the room on her way to meet up with Airborne. Airborne trots into a large central chamber deep inside of the stable. Instead of finding beds, inside of the stable's living quarters, there are row after row of cryotubes. Most of them are empty, with the exception of 5 of them that lie against the far wall. Trotting up to the cryotubes, Airborne raises a quivering hoof and wipes off the thick layer of ice that has accumulated on the glass surface of the tubes. The ice falls away, revealing the face of a male pony whose coat is light blue, his mane and tail are dark blue, and his cutie mark is a lightning bolt with wings. Airborne looks at the pony and brushes off the metal nameplate at the base of the tube, which reads,
"Soren."
Airborne looks at Sunrise, saying,
"Is there any way you can open them?"
She nods and says,
"Yes. As old as they are, the wiring and thawing procedures seem intact."
Airborne smiles and says,
After all this time, and they're still alive. Well, I think they'll have slept long enough. It's time they walked in the sun again after all this time. Start up the thawing procedures. The sooner we leave here, the better.
Sunrise links her pip-buck to a large terminal next to the row of cryotubes and works on initiating the startup procedures to unthaw the legendary Wonderbolts. Walking along the row of tubes, he brushes the ice away from the nameplates and reads them saying, Spitfire, Fleetfoot, Mistyfly, and look, even Firestreak is here. It looks like he managed to escape the destruction of Canterlot. Trotting up behind Airborne, Starshine pokes him in the flank. Airborne jumps a foot in the air and yelps loudly, saying,
Don't sneak up on me like that. You could have given me a heart attack.
She sticks her tongue out, saying,
Relax, Airborne. You're too jumpy.
Airborne snorts and sulks, turning his head away from her. The cryotubes open up, dumping ice onto the floor. The warm breath of the ponies melts the ice-covered glass on the inside of the tubes. Airborne trots to Soren's cryotube and looks at the pony's eyes as they flutter open and come into focus. Soren groggily sits up in his cryotube and leans over the side, vomiting onto the cement floor. Looking up at Airborne with his green eyes, he asks,
Who are you?
Airborne replies,
My name is Airborne. I'm glad to meet you, Soren.
Soren gets out of the cryotube, standing on his hooves, which wobble slightly. The other Wonderbolts climb out of their cryotubes. Spitfire stretches her wings while Firestreak vomits all over the inside of his cryotube, while Fleetfoot and Mistyfly grab their goggles from their footlockers next to their respective cryotubes. Soren looks at Airborne and asks,
What is your rank? Are you even with the Equestrian military?
Airborne shakes his head and replies,
I am not, Soren. There hasn't been a military force in Equestria for a long time.
Soren takes a few steps back and says,
Just how long exactly?
Airborne says,
I hate to tell you this, but it's been over 200 years since the end of the war. But there are some ponies that you know who are still alive, like Fluttershy and Rainbow Dash.
Soren looks at Airborne and says,
How do I know she is alive and that you aren't telling me a lie?
Airborne pulls out the photograph that Rainbow Dash gave him and hands it over to Soren, saying,
Rainbow Dash told me to give this to you when we found you, and said that you would know what it means.
Soren takes the photograph from Airborne and stares at it fondly, saying,
So she is alive? This is great!
Spitfire's ears perk up and she says,
So if it has been 200 years, who is still left up there to help?
Starshine replies,
Most of the ponies of Equestria died when the Balefire bombs went off. Ponies like Princess Luna, Rarity, and Pinkie Pie died when the bombs hit the major cities of Equestria. Those who were lucky enough to avoid being killed by the bombs found shelter in the stables across the land. Those who were unlucky became ghouls, which are nothing more than slobbering, mindless monsters. Living up there has been rough. Those who wander the wastes have had to make a lot of tough choices just to live another day, but things are starting to get better.
Spitfire looks at Airborne, saying,
So why does Rainbow Dash need our help after all this time?
Airborne replies,
There is a threat to Equestria that could undo everything we have fought so hard to achieve here. The reality is, there aren't that many Pegasi left out there in the wastes. After the bombs fell on Equestria, the remaining Pegasi closed up the sky and isolated themselves inside of their cloudy cities, not bothering to help those ponies down there. They called themselves the Grand Pegasi Enclave, and we have had trouble dealing with them up until a few months ago, when we repelled their assault on New Cloudsdale, where those who chose to leave the Enclave live. They, like me, call themselves Dash Hats in honor of Rainbow Dash, who decided to aid the ponies of Equestria rather than isolate herself from the world. This is why we need your help, Spitfire.
We need pony power. And who better to aid us in our time than the original Wonderbolts? Firestreak smiles and says,
All right, you can count me in. I've been asleep for 200 years. It's time I got back out there again. Besides, I imagine my flying skills are rusty after sleeping in these stupid things instead of training.
Behind him, Fleetfoot and Mistyfly nod in agreement. Spitfire smiles and says,
Well then, looks like we're all in. So, Airborne, take us to Rainbow Dash.
Just as Spitfire finishes speaking, Bailout trots into the room. Spotting the Wonderbolts, his jaw drops and his eyes widen. He quickly trots over and shakes their hooves, saying,
It's an honor to meet you all, and I'm glad for the opportunity to serve alongside the legendary Wonderbolts.
Spitfire looks at Airborne, saying,
Some pony's eager. Let me guess, he's new to this sort of thing.
Airborne smiles and nodding his head, saying,
Yeah, Bailout graduated from the academy a week ago, but he has proven himself to be quite capable in the field, and he's gotten us this far without risking himself most of the time.
Bailout hands Airborne a cloth-covered bundle, saying,
Check this out. You'll never guess what I found.
Taking the bundle, Airborne unwraps it and finds an assault rifle. The weapon is covered in gray and green, digital camo with a large scope. Held in place on the tactical rail below the barrel, a foregrip is attached to the lower tactical rail. On the magazine, well, there's an inscription that reads, All Equestrian, followed by a symbol that Airborne had only seen on the old banners inside of the Equestrian government buildings. The symbol is a bright sun on a red field, the flags of old Equestria. Soren looks at the weapon and says,
That was mine during the war. She served me well and saved my life more than once. I had her custom made from Firewing arms. I missed shooting her on the range in Canterlot when I was on leave for the military.
Airborne hands the weapon to Soren, saying,
Well, you have more claim over it than I do, since it belongs to you.
Soren pushes the weapon back to Airborne, saying,
My claim on that weapon died the day the bombs fell on Equestria. I hope she serves you well, Airborne, and take care of her.
Firestreak notices pistols holstered on Airborne's chest, saying,
You can have those as well. I never really had much use for them anyway. I always prefer to carry a shotgun into battle than dual pistols.
Airborne says,
Thank you for letting me keep them. I will make sure to clean them every day.
Starshine looks at Spitfire and asks,
How did you end up here anyway?
Spitfire pins her ears back and looks at the ground, saying,
We ran. That's how we ended up inside this stable.
Spitfire looks around at the dim interior of the cryo room, saying,
We were able to leave Canterlot just in time before the bombs fell. We watched as princesses erected a magical shield around the city, but we knew we couldn't do anything to help them. Soren had his orders from Rainbow Dash to go to Marston and wait for her to arrive, but she never did. We were only in the city for a few hours before the missiles struck. I can still feel the ground shaking under my hooves from the explosions. Every pony panicked as they tried to push and shove their way into the stable, but there wasn't enough time to get every pony in, so we sealed the stable off and listened to the screams of agony as those who were unfortunate souls died outside. Originally, this place was built to house at least 400 VIPs, but only 150 ponies made it inside. Most of them were military personnel and a few civilians. The stable's overmare was one of our younger recruits, named Whisperwing. We waited for the all-clear signal to be sent to the stable, but it never arrived. Most of the ponies in here figured out the situation pretty quickly after we had been in here for a week. That's when things began to fall apart. Some of the ponies, mainly the civvies and a few of the military ponies, advocated opening the stable door so they could go out and look for their families. But Whisperwing's orders were clear. No pony was to leave until we received an all-clear signal from either the government or stable tech. But her decision didn't sit well with those who wanted to leave, so they mutinied. The stable devolved into chaos, ponies killing each other hoof over hoof. Some killed themselves than rather live in this place. Eventually, Whisperwing sealed us inside of the cryopods, since we were the only VIPs inside of the stable. I don't know what happened to her after that.
Starshine hands Sunrise the ancient terminal pad, saying,
I found this up in the computer core. Maybe you can decode it to find out what happened here. And once we get back to New Cloudsdale, any of the names you find on there, we can add to the wall of remembrance.
Spitfire notices the revolver tucked into Starshine's utility barding, saying,
I guess since you found that, it means Whisperwing died after all. I personally gave that to her when we joined the Wonderbolts. Hopefully it was a quick death.
Airborne watches as the Wonderbolts suit up in their old armor and place their battle saddles on. Bailout gleefully helps Spitfire tighten the straps on Spitfire's battle saddle, while Airborne helps out Soren. As they make their way back to the stable, the Wonderbolts see the damage caused by the rioting, and the bones of the former residents to Stable 200. Spitfire remarks,
They deserve better than this, to die like some wild animals cooped up in a cage. That they have no idea would be their tomb. It's too cruel to imagine a fate such as this.
Starshine leads the group of ponies to the Overmare's office, where Spitfire and Soren buck open the door, pushing aside the barricade inside. Looking around, Soren says,
Must have been one hell of a fight. Looks like whoever was in here made their last stand. But it looks like the mutineers weren't able to get the door open, so these poor sods must have starved to death.
Fleetfoot looks over at the command console and says,
I don't think we'll be able to leave this place through the main entrance. The door diagnostic says the opening mechanism is damaged, but the secondary entrance seems to be clear, so I'm guessing that's how you lot managed to get in here in the first place.
Airborne says,
Are you sure there are no other ponies in the cryotubes?
Fleetfoot shakes her head and replies,
According to this, we were the only ponies who made it to the cryotubes. Every pony else died when the fighting broke out.
Fleetfoot presses a button and says,
This will open the secondary entrance when we get there, so let's hurry. I have had enough of this place for 2 lifetimes.
The ponies make their way out of the Overmare's office, with the Wonderbolts stopping inside of the armory to arm themselves. Airborne and his friends collect all of the extra guns and bullets into several large bags, placing them on their backs for the return journey. Soren, looking at them, says,
You guys are gonna fly all the way back to New Cloudsdale with all that stuff hanging off you? Things must be pretty desperate up there.
Airborne replies,
Rainbow Dash can fill you in when we get back to New Cloudsdale. Rainbow Dash can fill you in and when we get back to New Cloudsdale on the situation. But yes, things are desperate.
A few minutes later, the ponies arrive at the secondary entrance to Stable 200, and watch as the massive metal door rolls back, revealing the smelly sewers of Mareston. Misty Fly covers her nose with her hoof, saying,
Please don't tell me we have to walk through that nasty sludge. I'd rather be back in my cryotube than trotting that stuff.
Airborne replies,
It's the only way to get out of here. Besides, compared to this place, I would take a sewer filled with ghouls any day.
Soren snaps his head back around and stares at Airborne, saying,
You mean those things are in here?
Bailout replies,
Yes, sir. Unfortunately, we had a run with them earlier, but we blocked the passage, so I doubt they're going to be any threat to us as we leave this place.
Soren sighs and carefully steps over the threshold to Stable 200, into a world that he hasn't seen in 2 centuries. The other Wonderbolts follow his example and leave the tomb they had called home for so long. Trotting through the tunnels, Soren looks around, saying,
If this place is as grim as you say it is, I don't think I want to know what's on the surface when we get there.
Airborne replies,
The first time I saw Equestria, as it is now, I cried. It's hard to think of this place as it used to be after seeing what became after the war. At least you were lucky enough to have seen Equestria in its glory days, and meet the princesses.
Making their way to the collapsed portion of the tunnel, Soren and the rest of the Wonderbolts step out into daylight for the first time. Soren lifts his head and looks at the sky, taking a deep breath, saying,
I'm glad to finally feel the warmth of the sun on my back again.
Looking at the destruction caused by the war, he says,
It's hard to think this was Mareston. This place used to be a bustling city, and Equestria's largest port before the war. I would come here all the time with Rainbow Dash, and we would eat at our favorite restaurant. Although, I doubt there's much left of it now.
Spitfire, viewing the twisted and mangled corpse that was once the bright city of Mareston, says,
Is all of Equestria like this?
Starshine replies,
Unfortunately, yes, it is. Most of the cities look just as bad as this. No city was spared when the zebras bombed Equestria, not even Canterlot. Hardly any pony lives in the cities anymore, since they're death traps, crawling with all sorts of ponies who would slit your throat just so they could have an extra blanket, or a can of food if it meant they could survive another day out here.
Airborne looks at every pony and says,
I think we should just leave now. It's best not to linger in places like these. And we are in a hurry, so let's go.
As Airborne and the Wonderbolts rise higher into the sky, a lone figure stands in the window of a broken skyscraper, a ghoulish smile breaking across his lips. From behind him, a shadowy figure approaches, saying,
So the Dashites have revealed themselves. It's time to play your part, Marrow Muncher. Take your ghouls and attack Fluttershy's compound before the Dashites get a chance to strike. After you have killed them all, you will have what you want.
Marrow Muncher turns around and stares at the pony, saying,
If it wasn't for your guns, or our mutual interest to see these wormskins off our land, we would have dealt with you all long ago. This land belongs to the dead. You wormskins killed it and lost every right you had to it when the bombs fell. But I will honor our bargain, for we ghouls even have a notion of honor.
The figure slips back into the shadows, saying,
Just remember to leave Fluttershy alive. I want to personally carve out her heart as she watches all that she has done burn in front of her.
As Airborne and company leave the twisted remnants of the city of Mareston, Soren stops and hovers in place, staring back at the ruins, saying, I will find some way to right the wrongs I've done, even if it means I have to struggle to define myself in this new world, in which I don't belong. Soren turns his back on the dead city and races to catch up with Airborne as they fly into the setting sun. As night approaches, Sunrise pulls up the map on her pitbuck, saying, There is an old farm where we can stay for the night. This area doesn't nearly have as much radiation as the rest of this place. Landing in front of the barn, Starshine trots into the building and says, I will get a fire started. Airborne, why don't you find some lanterns so we can see what we're doing in here without tripping over something? Airborne rolls his eyes and says,
You could have asked Sunrise. She has a built-in flashlight in her pitbuck.
Starshine sniggers, saying, Well, she has actually made herself useful by guiding us here. You, on the other hoof, haven't. So get moving. Soren leans over and whispers to Bailout, saying, Are they always like this? Bailout shrugs and says,
Yeah, you'll get used to it. I learned to ignore them after the first day I spent with them. Besides, as far as romance goes, this is pretty much as good as it gets out here in the wasteland.
Bailout trots into the barn as Misty Fly trots to Soren's side, saying, I guess things have changed a lot in our absence. So what do you want us to do? Spitfire looks at her, saying,
Secure the perimeter. I want 3-hour shifts to keep watch if this place has changed so much. We have to be ready for anything. Firestreak, you will take the first shift, then Fleetfoot will relieve you. So let's get to it.
Both Firestreak and Fleetfoot salute Spitfire and say in unison,
Yes, ma'am.
Airborne searches through the piles of junk and debris inside of the barn. Overturning a wheelbarrow, he finds a couple of lanterns and shakes them to see if there's oil inside of them. Hearing the telltale slushing of liquid inside of the lanterns, pulling out a box of matches from his utility barding, he lights the lanterns, which cast a soft, warm glow all over the interior of the barn. Starshine finds a hole in the barn floor and quickly builds a fire. Setting the lanterns on the rusty aged pegs, Airborne trots to her side, saying,
"So, what do you think of our little adventure so far?"
She turns to him, saying,
Well, compared to last time when we were dodging both yetis and ghouls, this one isn't so bad.
She nuzzles him, saying,
Let's keep it that way, shall we? I can't afford to lose you like last time.
Airborne nickers happily and replies,
"Well, I came back, didn't I?"
Starshine nods, but says,
Yes, but I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't.
Soren trots over to the fire and says,
So, Airborne, want to do a bit of practice shooting?
Airborne looks at him, saying,
"I don't think that would be wise, given we're still in a dangerous place."
Soren snorts and says,
Come on, you really think any pony's going to get the drop on us? We are the Wonderbolts, after all. Besides, my comrades have this place locked down pretty tight, so we're safe to do what we want here. And to be honest, I need to hone my skills to what they were during the war. Which is one of the things I hate, having been kept on ice for all this time. Your skills tend to fall apart after a century.
Airborne finds some empty paint cans and stacks them on a row of barrels against the barn's far wall. He trots back over to Soren, saying,
"Okay, let's get shooting."
Soren trains the barrels of his battle saddle on the cans and fires at them, while Airborne pulls out the all-equestrian and loads a large magazine into it, then leans into the gun to make sure he compensates for the kick of the gun when he fires. Gently squeezing down on the trigger, he uses the scope to sight in on the farthest paint can. He pulls the trigger, feeling the butt of the gun slam into his shoulder, almost knocking him on his flank. His shot missing the paint can and instead passes through the roof of the barn, leaving a small hole in the ceiling. Soren chuckles, saying,
Maybe I should have told you that she tends to buck really hard when you pull the trigger. A word of advice, use the foregrip to steady your aim, then fire.
Airborne nods and sights down the scope again, grabbing onto the foregrip with his hoof, and fires. This time, the shot pierces the paint can, dead center, blowing the can in half. After a couple hours of shooting, Soren says,
All right, I think my skills are starting to come back to me. I don't think we should pop off any more rounds and risk running out of bullets when we really need them the most.
Airborne nods in agreement. Bedding down next to Starshine, Airborne pulls all equestrian close to him and tips the brim of his hat down over his face, as he drifts off to sleep with the greatest team of Pegasi at his side. End of Chapter 3.